Hi everyone! Today I'll be filming my reading wrap-up for the month of June. I have quite a few books to get through, so let's get started right away. The first book that I read in the month of June was This Is How You Lose a Time War by Max Gladstone and Amal and Motor. This book is about two agents, simply called Red and Blue, who have been involved in a war in the future involving time travel at the opposing sides of the war. This book is partially written in omniscient third-person narrative as well as in letter form between Red and Blue to each other. Max Gladstone, whose name is written in blue at the bottom of the title page, wrote Blue's letters, and I assume that Amal and Motor wrote Red's letters. I think that they both co-wrote the omniscient narrative parts together. I kind of hate it when the first book of each month is kind of bad or terrible, but I must say that I didn't quite enjoy This Is How You Lose the Time War, which was quite unfortunate because this book has been quite long in my TBR list. But so basically, this book is about Red and Blue's relationship, which blossoms into a romance as the book goes on. I don't think it's a spoiler to say that this is a romance book. I remember that at the back of the book, romance was revealed at the blurb at the back of the book. I would say that Red and Blue's relationship in itself was quite convincing, although I did find the relationship itself to be quite cliched. However, the problem came for me in the world building of the book. I felt that this relationship between Red and Blue existed in such a vacuum that the lack of the world building itself kind of made the romance and the elements of the romance quite meaningless. For example, the biggest threat of Red and Blue's relationship in this book, I would say, is the threat that if their relationship is discovered by the leader of each faction that Red and Blue is part of, then they are in quite existential danger. However, because the time war, as well as the faction's leaders, are so weakly described, I found that it was kind of hard to see the threat as anything real. Therefore, I found that when Red and Blue each make sacrifices to combat the threat, that those sacrifices themselves become quite vacuous as the threat was never real, had never seemed real. Yeah, so I had to give the book 2 stars out of 5, and I don't think I recommend the book, although I know that it remains quite popular in the booktube space, and the writing could be quite beautiful in some parts. Then I read Olga Tokarczuk's Flight. I was really impressed with this novel, as I had been with every other Tokarczuk novel that I had the privilege of reading. But I would say that Flight is a book that is quite hard to describe because it doesn't have any definite plot or structure. But I had few comments written down of my thoughts on the book as I was reading it, and also as I finished the book. I mean, I kind of realized that I looked down at my laptop for my script a bit too much in my previous videos, so I'm trying not to do that as much. But with this book, as I said, it was kind of hard to find a succinct way to describe my impression of the book, so forgive me for looking down to my script here. So first, I would say that this novel is a very unique novel, and the central theme, if again, like I said, the book is quite hard to describe, but the central theme, at least the theme that the book focuses on, I felt was the flight of the body in the world, with Tokarczuk's work focusing on the two themes of the body and the world. So, and the structure kind of mirrors that. Like the structure of the novel is very loose. The novel is filled with sections of various lengths containing descriptions or stories or narratives or personal narratives, and I felt that this loose description and these loose sections themselves create something akin to the cosmopolitan world. And another thing that I noted was that, and this was something common that I found in the books that Tokarczuk wrote that I read, and I think this is in contrast with many so-called great books and many so-called great books that focus on the mental state, soul, or spirit of an individual. But I think one thing that is really interesting about Tokarczuk's literature is that it kind of focuses on the body in a very unique way rather than the mental state. And in this novel, Flights, in focusing on the two topics, the body and the world, I think the novel is arguing that a body is sort of a word as well. For example, see this quote. In page 175, there's a quote that says, "Once the gods were external, unavailable from another world, and their apparent emissaries were angels and demons. But the human ego burst forth and swept the gods up and inside, furnished them a place somewhere between the hippocampus and the brainstem, between the pineal gland and Broca's area. Only in this way can the gods survive, in the dark, quiet nooks of the human body, in the crevices of the brain, in the empty space between the synapses." Even in this quote, that is kind of like describing, I guess, the mental processes of how human body operates. Tokarczuk focuses very physically on each structure of a body, each bodily structure, using terms like brainstem, hippocampus, Broca's area, etc., rather than using maybe a more symbolic word, like symbolic or theoretical word, even including that theoretical thing of like gods into that physical structure. And I would say, in looking at these two topics, world and body, and like in arguing that a body can be also a kind of a world, there is no easy resolution of these two distinct topics even at the end of the book Flights. However, I felt that in the end there was a slight argument of a resolution made in this book. Tokarczuk seemed to be arguing that the writing of all these stories into the novel, which itself, as I said, the structure of itself kind of seemed similar to a cosmopolitan world, is in itself a flight, thereby like creating this like structural resolution within the novel's aesthetic vision. I'm not sure if I explained it very clearly. But however, as I said, that resolution did not seem quite conclusive. And although like I think normally I would feel that this kind of like open ending, open conclusion, lack of resolution would, for me, it would seem quite self-indulgent. However, I think the reason I still love Tokarczuk's works is because Tokarczuk's language is quite exquisite, possibly primarily because of her very unique way of seeing the world. And to end this quite long section of giving my impression of Tokarczuk's flight, and also a recommendation. This is a recommendation of this book. I kind of wanted to end this section. I wanted to introduce two quotes that I felt really showed how beautiful and unique Tokarczuk's sentences can be. So I would say that her prose is beautiful and strange throughout, but I picked these two quotes because they are quotes that deal with quite themes that are quite common in literature, but in these two quotes, we see that Tokarczuk is able to deal with these quite common literary themes in a very unique way. So first, there's this quote in page 221. This big, sturdy body makes an enormous impression on her. She feels her legs get slow and heavy, and her body opens up from below, and that's how it feels. It opens up to the shoulder, to the veil. She clenches her teeth so tight, her head roars. She starts to walk along the canal towards him, but in the end, she slows and stops. She's overcome by a strange feeling that the water here is overflowing onto the banks. Gently, at first checking with the first waves the place of its expansion, then it grows bolder, pours out onto the paving stones, and in a moment it's reached the first steps of the nearest house's stairs. Charlotta feels distinctly the weight of the element. Her skirts absorb the water, become leaden, she can't move. She feels this flood in every inch of her body and sees the surprised boats battering the trees, always lined up with their bows against the current. Now they've lost their direction. I don't think I need to explain this quote. It is obviously a description of a moment where a woman feels certain sexual awakening, and I thought Tokarczuk made a description of that moment in a quite unique way. And the second quote is on perhaps literature's commonest topic, death. This was on, I don't know which page it was. I didn't note that, but the quote says, tell me a story about something, he says. Stumped, she clears her throat. He prompts her, tell me what it's like where you are. So she starts. It's the middle of the summer. The lemons on the trees are ripe now. He interrupts. Can you see the ocean from your window? Yes, she says. When the tide goes out, the water leaves seashells in its wake. But this is a ruse. He hadn't planned to listen, and for a moment his gaze clouds over, but then its former sharpness is restored. Then he looks out at her from very far away, and then she knows that he is no longer a part of the world where she is. She could not have identified exactly what it was she saw in him, whether fear and panic or precisely the opposite, relief. Faintly he conveys, clumsily and in a whisper, his gratitude or something like it, and then he goes to sleep. Then she takes the vial from her purse and fills the syringe up with its contents. She removes the drip from the IV and slowly injects all of the droplets of the liquid she has brought. Nothing happens aside from the fact that his breathing stops suddenly, naturally, as though the movement of his ribcage from before had been an odd anomaly. She runs her hand over his face, reinserts the drip into his IV, and smooths out the place on the sheets where she'd been sitting. Yeah, so these were the two quotes I wanted to pick out to read to you guys. as I said, the writing is so good throughout. I do recommend you guys to read this book. If I don't think like this book itself is a great introduction to Tokarczuk as an author. For that introduction, I do recommend Drive Your Plow over Dead Man more. But if you had read this author before, then I think Flights is a really good continuation of experiencing Tokarczuk's literary prowess. The third book that I read in the month of June was this book, which contains selections of H.L. Mencken's book collected by James T. Farrell, who I think seems to be an English professor. I got this book in a used bookstore, so for me this book was quite satisfactory, but I would say because the book doesn't contain any context, any biographical context or any context for each of the texts, I wouldn't say this was the best introduction for Mencken's writing. I saw that Penguin has some works by Mencken, so I think those might be better. And then onto Mencken's writing itself. So for the last few months, I've kind of been reading older writings, older essays, older famous essays, and I've kind of read the most notable works that I've read were like selected writings by Ruskin, which I read in an Oxford World Classics version, and then Woolf's. I also read Woolf's The Common Reader, and then this book by which contains selections of Mencken's writings. I would say of these three, so like yeah, to make it kind of like a comment sandwich. As you can see from my annotations, I kind of annotated a lot. Mencken is definitely very quotable. There were a lot of moments where his quite vitriol comments on almost everyone and everything made me laugh quite a lot. And like I saw that there were some quotes that I knew from like my life, but I didn't know that it was from Mencken. And those I also kind of annotated on. But despite that, I would say among the three at least that I mentioned, Ruskin, Mencken, and Woolf, I would say Mencken has weathered the passage of time kind of the worst. I had kind of found Ruskin's writing really eloquent, and also because the Oxford World Classics version kind of contained almost like writings from almost each of Ruskin's life. I found that his writings, which kind of seem to contain some insanity or madness that Ruskin faced in his later years, I found that very touching and quite affecting. And obviously Woolf is a genius of prose, and The Common Reader was a delight to read through and through. However, with Mencken, I think there is definitely some historical interest. If you're interested in this era, I would say the 1920s. But I don't think there is any special literary merit in reading him in the 21st century, unless you are specifically looking for some bawdy vitriol fun. Mencken's work, his rough humor was interesting, as I said. It was really fun to read. It made me laugh a lot. But like I'm not trying to evaluate Mencken by the 21st century ethical lens, but many of his writings contain aspects of racism, xenophobia, etc. And I also found it quite interesting that despite him writing some of the works in here just right after the Civil War, and obviously he knew what slavery was, he made very flippant comments, very flippant analogy to slavery, which I didn't find to be quite, I didn't find that analogy to be a very enlightening or honest one, if that makes sense. And also, I would say in his writings, Mencken is revealed to be a very cynical man, to what I thought was a degree of absurdity. And in some of his like later writings, it is kind of, I think it is kind of revealed why he became so cynical. But I don't know, it is like, for me at least, like for me subjectively, cynicism has always felt to be kind of like a mark of immaturity, at least for me. So I didn't really enjoy that aspect of his writings as well either. Yeah, so I didn't like the cynicism of his writings there, and also his writings tended to be a bit provincial for my taste too, so I didn't like that aspect either. Still, I said I had laughed quite a lot reading this book, and I'm kind of glad to have read Mencken, because he's such a famous author, and I think when someone is quite as famous as him, you are kind of curious about his writings. Then I read the first book in Anthony Powell's series, A Question of Upbringing. In this first novel, our main character, Jenkins, goes through, graduates from his college, from his school years, and then goes off to France. And then after returning from France, he attends, I think it was Oxford University. Yeah, I'm sure it was Oxford University. And throughout the process, he encounters experiences of first love. Yeah, and I would say this book, A Question of Upbringing, was a really great introduction to the series, A Dance to the Music of Time. I thought that the novel had great writing, although I felt the author kind of overused multisyllabic words, which kind of made his sentences to be a bit too heavy. Although I think that might be explained by the distance between the narrative voice, which is Jenkins in his adult years, and the portrayal of Jenkins in the story as a flashback of Jenkins in his very younger self. And I think for me, the series was recommended for me as kind of a comedy of manners, and I think the promise was definitely delivered. The book contains several brilliant character studies. I especially enjoyed the character studies of Sunny Fairweather, Wrapup, and Quiggin. I felt that they were really sensitively and hilariously done. I say hilariously because the book in itself, the novel in itself, contains some kind of it is written in a tone of deadpan humor, deadpan kind of wiry humor, which I really enjoyed. I would say for me, at least when I was introduced to this book, there was a lot of comparison between first In Search of Lost Time and this series. I would say the depth and psychological acuity of In Search of Lost Time is quite lacking in A Question of Upbringing, at least. But I mean, compared to a single book in the 7-volume series of In Search of Lost Time, which often goes to 400 pages, and A Question of Upbringing was about 250 pages only. So in the relative brevity of the book, I felt that there was an effort by Anthony Powell, the author, to explore similar themes of time, memory, and then also like societal descriptions that also exist in Search of Lost Time. All in all, I would say A Question of Upbringing was a great read, great read, and a great introduction to the series. I am really excited to continue with this series in the next month. I actually have, and the review of the second book will be in my July wrap-up. The fifth book that I read in June was Anya Satton's Catherine. I read Catherine for the BookTube event, Read Historical Fiction 2026. I am so glad to have read this book, and it was such an unexpected read for me in many ways. So obviously Catherine is a historical fiction, and it is set in the English history era of Henry III and Richard II, from Henry III to Richard II. In sum, the novel entails the love story between Joan of Gaunt and Catherine Swynford. So Joan of Gaunt was the second son of Henry III and uncle to Richard II, and also father to Henry IV, who would go on to dethrone Richard II. So obviously, he was a pretty major figure in English history. And Catherine Swynford starts this novel as a mere yeoman's daughter, but she actually ends her life as a Duchess of Lancaster after finally being married to John of Gaunt in his third marriage. As can be seen in the summary and the title, because the main character is not Joan of Gaunt, but it is Catherine, the story can be quite dramatic. However, this quite long book takes its time, and I would say that it gives its characters opportunities to grow and change, and opportunity to basically live a life. This opportunity, the author Anya Satton uses amply, and I think Satton has a talent for writing characters with psychological acuity that makes her characters feel really alive. I would say that Catherine, as well as the other characters in this novel, are obviously real life people, but like there were some moments where I felt that I understood these characters even more than the closest people that I have in my lives, because Satton was able to describe these characters so well and was able to make these characters feel so realistic psychologically. And because of that psychological acuity, I would say that Satton's medieval world building also felt very realistic and quite immersive. I would say I think that perhaps Catherine was the best book that I read in June, with the caveat that I don't quite know best novel that I read in June, with the caveat that I don't quite know if I can classify Tokarczuk's Flight as a novel in itself. The next book that I read was Joyce Carol Oates' The Grave Digger's Daughter. Joyce Carol Oates has been really long in my TBR list, and it is a kind of a disappointment when the first book you read of such an author is a disappointment. But I have to say that I didn't love The Grave Digger's Daughter so much. So in summary, actually the book promises really a lot. So in this book, the main character, Rebecca Schwartz, is the daughter of a Jewish gravedigger who had, with his family, escaped to the United States from Nazi Germany just before the Second World War. The book follows through Rebecca Short's life, which is quite dramatic, starting with her father's murder-suicide of her mother, her own failed first marriage with an abusive husband, her flight from this abuser with her son by changing her name to Hazel Jones, etc. And the plot summary that I made just now happens just in the first part of this tripartite novel. So again, like this novel, at least in its summary, is a quite exciting and dramatic book. However, for such a dramatic book, I felt when I was reading this book that the novel could be quite boring and drowsy. And yeah, and this is obviously just a critique of the novel and how it was written rather than like its historical context. But so you should take it as that. Please take all my comments in good faith. But I would say a critical problem that happened in this novel was that almost all of the characters just seem to exist passive to their historical context, mostly in victimhood. So obviously, like historically, it is understandable that a Jewish immigrant who has just escaped from Nazi Germany is obviously a survivor, is obviously like a victim of their historical times, especially if they also face quite vitriolic anti-Semitism in the United States, which definitely happened. However, this choice, like I don't know if I should call it choice, but like this fact of the character's passive existence kind of ended up creating mere shadows of characters, including in the case of Rebecca, who is supposed to be the main character of this story. Yeah, so that was probably why I found the novel quite undramatic at most of its time, and it is also why I enjoyed the second and third part of the novel at least better. In these latter two parts of the novel, the focus is still on Rebecca, but also on Rebecca's son, a piano prodigy, and a character called Chet Gallagher. These two characters are possibly because of their distance between the historical context of Nazi Germany and the anti-Semitism that had existed before the Second World War in the United States, these two characters are able to exist in further distance from the historical context and the victimhood that the context creates. And in that distance, these two characters are more able to actively interact with their respective backgrounds, making them much more multidimensional as characters. Yeah. So this was a complicated, I would say The Gravedigger's Daughter was quite a complex work. However, I don't know if I can recommend the book. If you guys have any more recommendation of Joyce Carol Oates' works that I might enjoy more, then leave them in the comments. The final reading that I did in the month of June was a reread of Henry James' The Portrait of a Lady. I think the top 10 novels video that I did at the end of last month is kind of inspiring me to do rereads of all these great books. So yeah, and for The Portrait of a Lady, I had the happy experience of enjoying the reread quite as much, if not much more, than the first reading of the book that I did. I had read the book. I had read The Portrait of a Lady in the summer vacation between my second sophomore year and junior year of college, so more than 5 years ago. So I kind of found that I had forgotten several critical incidents that happens in this quite dramatic book. And I was really happy to make new recognition of these incidents. I also was really happy to renew my acquaintance with my formerly favorite characters and still my favorite characters of Isabel Archer and Ralph Tuchet. They're just created so well. Although I must say, like with Isabel Archer, I kind of had a different impression when I was doing my reread, as opposed to doing my in relation to doing my first read of the book. Because I think 5 years ago when I was doing my first reading of this book, as with Isabel Archer's first two suitors, Warburton and Lord Warburton and Caspar Goodwood, I think I was kind of in love with Isabel Archer as a character just throughout and throughout. But I think in this reread, perhaps because I knew the mistake that she would make in her marriage choice from the start, her pride and limitations were more notable than when I had read the book for the first time. But I would say that this taking more notice of her pride and limitations did not take away from her very lifelikeliness and grandness of character. She's still a really great character, and she's probably one of my favorite literary characters of all time. Also, I think this time I was able to better appreciate Caspar Goodwood and kind of strangely Mrs. To just function in the story a bit more. Isabel's and Caspar Goodwood's conversations always seem like exciting fencing matches between two equally strong presumptive minds. And I enjoyed how dramatic they were, and I also enjoyed seeing the consequences of those conversations on Isabel, and how the conversation affect her as a character. And with the villains, especially with Osmond, with Gilbert Osmond, and his narrowness of mind, I think reading him with more age and experiences under my belt was even more terrible as to in relation relative to when I read him for the first time. And I think part of the reason was that I kind of recognized that his villainy, which exists in his self-absorption and tyranny of a mind, are not mere literary faults, but they are characteristics that exist in people that exist in reality, I think. Another thing, and this was kind of by accident, but this read through, I read the 1881 version instead of the New York edition that was edited and kind of revised by Henry James later on his life. And this was honestly by accident. So when I was first reading the book, first reading James, the Portrait of a Lady, I was reading it in class for a course in college. So, and the course textbook was the Oxford Word Classics version, which was the New York edition. And for this reread, I got, because I had so many annotations that it was kind of hard to read the text of the portrait of the book. I had to get a new book from my local library, and I kind of wanted to get a different edition with different introduction because I wanted to read a different critical opinion on the book. So I got the Penguin version, but there are two Penguin versions, obviously, but one with the 1881 edition and one with the New York edition. And the strange thing is the cover of the 1881 version is like more distinct from the Oxford World Classics version cover of the Portrait of a Lady. So that was the version that I got. And and obviously that the version that I got from the local library was the 1881 version, which I only noticed after I returned from the library. Excited to read this book. But I must say, I did enjoy reading this earlier version of The Portrait of a Lady. There was a comparison chart between the two editions at the end of the book in the appendices, comparing the most critical changes that James made, including the edits at the ending. And also I also must say, I think I enjoyed Philip Horne's introduction, which exists in this Penguin version of the Portrait of a Lady, more than the introduction that exists in Oxford World Classics version of the Portrait of a Lady. I would say my impression of Henry James is that he is quite academic all on his own, and the introduction in Oxford World Classics was also really stiff and academic, and that was a bit too much for me. But Philip Horne's introduction in the Penguin version of the book was a bit more casual, and I kind of enjoyed that aspect of the introduction a lot. And like, yeah, so so all in all, I would say I was really happy to have reread The Portrait of a Lady, which has so long been in my list of favorite novels of all time, as you could see in my top 10 novels video last month. So I am really glad to have reread this book, and I am so happy that even in rereading this novel, my impression of the book has only increased rather than like decreased. So these are the novels that I read in June. What are some of the books that you enjoyed last month? Let me know in the comments, and come back. See you.